Hey everyone, so I just wanted to give you kind of a quick introduction to Rousseau. Because of the fall break, we don't have the class on Monday where we'd have our second discussion of the Dutch genre paintings and normally would have the lead into our next reading. So I'm giving you this kind of video introduction to Rousseau, give you some sense of Rousseau's context, why Rousseau is important, and some of the things to focus in on when you're reading Rousseau, which can be a little bit challenging. You're going to have to struggle with Rousseau a little bit. It's one of the more difficult philosophical texts we'll read, but I encourage you to struggle with it because I think Rousseau is worth it. So a little bit about Rousseau, the person. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born 1712 in Geneva, and he died in 1778 in France. And he's probably one of the most famous political philosophers of the European Enlightenment, though he is intensely critical of many of the contemporary philosophers and some of the broad characteristics that we associate with the Enlightenment. And particularly in terms of political theory, so things like representative democracy, the centrality of private property is really problematic for Rousseau. You'll definitely see that in the discourse on the origins of inequality. And also its excessive individualism is going to bother Rousseau a little bit. Rousseau had an incredibly difficult childhood and early adulthood. His mother died 9 days after he was born, and so then he kind of fell into the care of his father. And Rousseau and his brother were kind of shuffled all around Europe. They were sent to live with different relatives and also kind of put into various apprenticeships, but they didn't have that kind of traditional home life. And though he was born in Geneva, Switzerland, he really, throughout his entire life, lived all over Europe. He would return to Switzerland. He spent quite a bit of time in Paris. He lived for a time in Britain with another political philosopher, another philosopher named David Hume, associated with the Scottish Enlightenment. And he worked in various kind of occupations and trades. He was apprenticed as a watchmaker. He worked as a composer of music, and he actually developed a new form of musical notation. And he worked as a civil servant in various capacities. So he kind of was all over the place. He lived kind of a bohemian lifestyle, didn't have a very stable life. And he actually didn't start to really garner any acclaim as a philosopher until he was fairly late in life for that time period. So the first discourse, the Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, that was published in 1750. At that point, Rousseau would have been about 38 years old. So he had lived quite a significant portion of his life without being recognized as a writer or a philosopher. But from that point on, he wrote quite a bit, and he wrote broadly. So he wrote about politics, he wrote about philosophy, he wrote about religion, he wrote about education. Some of his most controversial work was on education. He published a book called Emile that was Rousseau's vision of what an ideal education should be. He was contrarian. He could be very biting in his criticism, and I think you'll get that sense as you read his work. And he was notoriously intense, both as a philosopher, you'll see some of that intensity in what you read, and as a human being. I mentioned that he went to live with David Hume. He lived with David Hume because he was essentially in trouble. The authorities, after he published Emile, were kind of up in arms with Rousseau, and so he went to Britain to kind of escape their wrath. And he lived with Hume for a time, and then he became convinced that Hume was out to get him. He thought that Hume was intercepting his mail and reading his mail, it all came to a head when he heard something that Hume apparently said in his sleep and confronted him the next day, thought that Hume was really kind of meant him harm. And he took his dog and they left, and he stormed off and had very little interaction with Hume ever again. And Hume said at that point, I really think you've lost your grip on reality. So he was intense and maybe a little bit erratic, particularly towards the end of his life. In terms of his ideas, he really emphasizes the community over the individual, and he wants to construct a system in which we do not assign away our political responsibilities. Remember, Locke was talking about representative democracy. Rousseau is famous for his critique of representative democracy. He thinks that as soon as we create representatives, we have created a system in which the government is no longer representing our interests. He doesn't think that representative democracy is possible. He thinks that's just setting up a system in which some other individuals pursue their own interest and don't pursue your interest. And he really wants to see direct democracy. He wants to see individuals not think in terms of what he calls their particular will or their sense of self-interest, but he wants people to think in terms of a general will, or kind of a communal set of interests, a communal identity, a communal understanding. And that's going to be really, really hard to develop, particularly in the society in which he lived, where he thought that individual interest and self-interest of us as individuals really was what kind of dominated. So the main themes in Rousseau, the things that you should really focus on, a critique of private property and the inequality that's emerging. Rousseau will be very, very influential for the French Revolution. They're going to draw upon the ideas of Rousseau. And mainly what drove the French Revolution was the extreme, extreme inequality that existed between the French aristocracy and the classes below them. There wasn't really a middle class. When we talked about the Dutch genre painting, he said, oh, there was this emergence of a middle class. Same thing doesn't happen in France until much, much later. And that was what drove both the initial impulse for the revolution and some of the subsequent bloodshed. Also, community and communal identity and interests, this idea of the general will. That's another main theme in Rousseau. The general will is really hard to figure out. It's hard to figure out exactly what he means, and it's something I think more demanding than the terminology we sometimes use, the common good. I don't think it's just kind of what is in the best interest of the nation. I really think it's kind of exercising the individual interest, the self-interest out of us, and learning to think in terms of a broader community. And for that reason, people sometimes credit Rousseau as the founder of communism, as the founder of fascism, as the founder of totalitarianism, because it's about getting your own individual interest out of yourself and then kind of giving yourself over to some larger entity. I don't know that that's fair. I think that's kind of an exaggeration, but many people say, if people read Rousseau and they misinterpret Rousseau, we can very easily end up with Nazi Germany or Cambodia under Pol Pot, those sorts of situations. And then lastly, we've been talking about reason. We've been talking about rationality. We encountered this with Kant, Bacon, Locke, the emphasis on rationality and reason. And Rousseau is kind of skeptical towards reason. He thinks that reason and rationality primarily are used as tools to harm others. He thinks that rationality becomes instrumental and we use it to advance our own interests and kind of overpower others, and also to just kind of rationalize our actions in the worst sense of the word. Yeah, I killed this person, or yeah, I hurt this person, but here's why I needed to do that. Here's why that person deserved that. We use rationality in really negative ways. And he says that the defining characteristic of human beings is their sense of pity or their ability to feel compassion. He says that's kind of wired into us, and that's what makes us distinct and kind of important. So some key questions to think about. One, do you agree with Rousseau's critique? He paints a really gloomy picture of society at his time, and it could be argued that it's only gotten worse since the time Rousseau was writing. He would focus on our strange combination of being self-interested but also obsessed with the opinion of others, the inequality between the rich and the poor, the instrumentalization of our relationships with other human beings, and really just the lack of connection and responsiveness of our political systems but our larger social institutions as well. Do you agree with that? Is something to think about. Does Rousseau kind of exaggerate the case there? And then also, and this is more kind of on the social contract, those excerpts that you're reading. How can we use Rousseau in terms of thinking about our political institutions? Rousseau is very honest in the social contract when he says he's not designing a template for a large country, right? This probably won't work in France, or it won't work in Britain, or certainly won't work in the United States, given how large we are. He says it might work in small city-states. So think of like his home city of Geneva. It might work there. So is it useless to us? Is the social contract just totally useless? Or can we use Rousseau's ideas to maybe think critically about alternative structures within our own society, even if it doesn't mean getting rid of the presidency and the Congress and all of the political institutions we've created? Are there ways that we can kind of inject Rousseau into our representative, more detached structure to make it more responsive to individuals and to think about ourselves as a broader political community? So those are some things to think about. I'm looking forward to our conversation with Rousseau. I think Rousseau is fascinating, and there's so much to dig into with Rousseau. Do remember that you're reading excerpts. You're reading from the second discourse, the discourse on the origins of inequality, and also the social contract, but you're not reading the whole thing. You're reading selections. So take a good look at the syllabus and make sure that you're reading the right sections. And also use the reading questions that I passed out before the fall break to kind of help you sort through some of this stuff, because it can be a little bit complex. So I'll wrap up there. I hope you guys have a great fall break. You enjoy a couple days off, and remember that I said too that there's nothing that's due over fall break, even though you would typically have a reflection due, or you would have an application paper due. All that stuff is due the Wednesday that we come back. So have a good break. Thanks.